So I'm going to address the first question, I guess, to the author closest to me, Mr. Miller. You and all the writers here have written about South Korea for now many years. Obviously, you are not native to South Korea. You are all from other places, other countries, other continents, other hemispheres. What would you say are the biggest challenges, dangers, or pitfalls about writing about South Korea, and how have those challenges changed over the multiple decades that you've lived here?
I think one of the challenges that I faced as a writer is trying to define who my audience is. Because for many expat writers, we want to write about our experiences in South Korea. So when I'm writing, I'm always trying to think of my audience in terms of who they are and what do they know about Korea. I mean, most people when they think about Korea, South Korea, North Korea, of course, they're thinking about the Korean War, thinking about sort of the ongoing sort of confrontation between North Korea and U.S. with Donald Trump and Kim Jong-un. So it's always a matter of trying to find that niche audience, or trying to sort of help to explain to whoever audience it might be, what it's like living in Korea and sort of writing about the things that I do. So that's one of my challenges as a writer. Okay. Mike or John?
I think mine's slightly different. My audience, I'm glad you guys are here today, because my audience, or the reader I have in mind when I write, at least when I write books, is an expat who has some experience of Korea, or and the type of things, the approach I take is I want people to think, oh, that happened to me. Or, yeah, I know that, actually, I hadn't thought about that for a long time. Oh, that's the explanation for that. So the audience is kind of fixed, the reader is fixed in the mind. I think the biggest challenge for me over the years has been Korean language. Actually, two things. One is Korean language, because I'm ashamed to say, although I feel I'm probably in good company, that I'm sort of functionally illiterate in this society. I've only learned enough Korean for what I need to do. And I can read Korean, but it takes me sort of half a day to get through a page, so I don't bother. So I'm sure there's a lot of there is a wealth of information out there about what I'm writing about that I can't access. And connected to that problem is a slightly different one. I'm sure you've all had this experience where, when you live here, you sort of feel this place is kind of the center of the world. You feel it's really important. But then when you go home, or when you even go nearby in the region, Hong Kong and places, you find it's not that well known. And the Koreans sometimes do things, like 1 million people come out on the street and protest and impeach a president, and you're sort of a bit befuddled, thinking, well, why did that just happen? And I think, in my experience, and I've had some reporting experience in other countries, like Indonesia and places like that, and I found there that you can immediately go to people and they will explain things to you. But I've always found in Korea that Koreans themselves are not very good at explaining some of the things that go on in their country to foreign audiences. So you end up trying to figure it out yourself. So I think those have been my two main challenges.
Please hold your applause to the end. Thank you. You can applaud whenever you want.
I'm also, I count myself among the people who struggle with language as well as an obstacle toward a lot of the things I would like to do as a writer, in terms of accessing information and just being as comfortable in Korean as I am in English. So you're not alone. I'm definitely one of those. For me, the big challenge with this book is because this is a guidebook, and my aim was to try to explain Korean culture in a way that would be useful to someone who's coming here to live, so more like a practical guide to culture, if you'd like to put it that way. So the challenge for me was just trying to, number one, to describe the country in broad strokes, which is hard enough, I think, when you're writing about any country, you want to get it right. But I think, especially with a country like Korea, which is so dynamic and changes so much, my fear that I would submit my manuscript, and by the time it hit the shelves, it would already be like half out of date, In fact, I submitted my manuscript, and about a week later, the president was impeached. You had the same problem. And I got an email from my editor saying, oh, there's still a little time before it goes to the printer. You want to say something maybe about that? And I thought, yeah, maybe that's a good idea. So, so I added a little bit at the end, just mentioning that. So that was my fear, that you just don't, you want it to be, I mean, you have to accept that it's going to be out of date, probably pretty quickly. I mean, Michael, you've written an update. Well, you set out to write an update, if I understand, but you ended up writing an entirely new book. And I think that's kind of was the challenge for me.
Sort of to follow up on this question of audience, most of your work seems to be intended for, of course, English speakers, expats, or even people back home. No doubt, at some point, at some level, Koreans become aware of your work, read it. I'm wondering, we live in the age of political correctness and cultural appropriation, seems to be a hot term these days. Have you ever run into any problems about people asking, how can you write about Korea because you are not Korean?
Foreigner.
Because you are a foreigner. I'm wondering, how is your work received, and what kind of feedback you've gotten from Koreans about your work?
Generally, I mean, as I write, I don't really write for Koreans, number one. So Koreans do come to me and say, oh, I want to read this book. And the first thing I say, after thank you is, well, I didn't really write it for you. I mean, because I'm really trying to explain, how to live in Korea and adapt to Korea. And, if you're Korean and you haven't done that by now, I really can't help you. But there is a curiosity. I find a lot of people, a lot of Korean colleagues and friends, they want to know kind of how foreigners see Korea. They're interested in kind of the foreign take on Korea. How does Korea appear through my eyes and the eyes of other foreigners? So I get a lot of curiosity. The book has just come out. I don't know that none of my Korean friends have read it, but the reaction to some of my past work has been positive. When I tell, in general, not only the book, but a lot of my other short pieces have been toward the same end, which is trying to just sort of demystify Korea, make it a bit easier for people to live here. When I tell Koreans that's what I do, they go, "Oh, good, please more of that. Keep doing that." So it's been fairly positive from my experience.
Yeah, mine slightly different in that. One of the best compliments I ever had from a Korean was when I wrote my first book a few years ago now. One Korean, quite a well-known Korean journalist, he read it. It was translated into Korean, and this one's being translated into Korean now. So I might be able to answer that question better next year. But this journalist said to me, when I read your book, I felt naked, and I took that as a compliment. Even though he was conveying something a little bit uncomfortable. And I think it's because with my background as a journalist you tend to be quite rude, or you're very critical. So I'm very aware that I might upset Koreans with things I say. By and large, I've been...
You're outing them.
Well, yeah. I found that to my face, my writing's been well received. Funny enough, since we may talk later about Park Geun-hye, that whole incident, but I've written a few articles a few columns in Korean and international papers about that, and I've got a lot of very positive emails, but they're from a sector of society that I don't feel that I actually relate to very well. And it's more the people on the right who are waving flags and saying it's all a North Korean plot. And they feel that I'm sort of doing a good job for them, so that's a little bit puzzling for me. The negativity, this thing that you were alluding to, I think cultural appropriation probably isn't quite the right thing, because we're not exactly turning something that belongs to Korea into something that it shouldn't be. It's more, and this is sort of thing I've seen in online commentary, and I've found that it comes specifically from Korean Americans or overseas Koreans. It's who does this guy think he is? What does he know about Korea? And if they're actually saying, I don't really relate to a foreigner writing about my culture that I kind of grew up in, even if I do live in the States, then I understand it. Because you have to, when you read a book, it's like you're going on a journey with an author and you have to feel comfortable with them. If you don't relate to them, then that's fine. That's a judgment that anybody can make. But I do object to the more extreme expressions of that. I've had some comments like, you know, what right, who gave this guy the right to, you know, there's no such thing as somebody having a right to write about a book. He's right, it's a marketplace, there are no rights being given out. I've had some unpleasant commentary, but nothing to my face. Maybe tonight might.
Well, as for myself, I think what John was saying, most of the people who have read, actually I've written 2 books about Korea. One was on the Korean War, and my current one. And from students and colleagues, my Korean colleagues, they're always surprised at what I know about Korea, what they don't know. Things that I might have discovered on my own, things that I might have come across. So they feel a little bit embarrassed that I'm actually writing about history that they don't, or they don't know much about. So maybe that's good for me being able to, you know, to getting back to that question about audience, that there are people who when they read the books of mine, they learn something. So if that's the case, then I've done my job as a writer.
I'm going to move on to another question. It's a question I like to ask of journalists or reporters, or really any kind of expert on a given place. What aspects or topics of South Korea do you feel are being underreported or overlooked? And why don't we start with Jeffrey?
I would have to say the adoptees, Korean adoptees that were, you know, adopted by many countries in the 1950s, 1960s. And one thing which I'm seeing right now, what's happening in the United States with the Dreamer program, is where some of these orphans who were adopted, a lot of the paperwork was lost. And now some of these Korean Americans are growing up and they don't have the documentation. And there's been a few stories about them being deported, coming back to South Korea and being sort of a foreigner in their own land. So this is something I think we're going to see more. I think I'm surprised that it hasn't been covered a lot. So who knows? Maybe the next novel or next something that's going to be written will be about these adoptees, perhaps coming back, searching for their roots, searching to find out, who they actually are.
Roots.
Yeah, I think there are certain themes which I think are underreported. One which Jeffrey just referred to. I think there was another one in my mind that will come back in a minute. But one of the things I'd like to say is the Korean, for reporters, writers are slightly different because we can go in depth on certain things. Foreign correspondents who report on a country are often criticized for not covering certain things better. But a lot of what you learn or you know about a country is what is in its own media. Now, the South Korean media has a couple of problems. One of them is that its style of reporting is quite passive. If you look at how newspapers are structured and how journalists write, they tend to write on the basis of press releases which are issued out of government offices and out of chaebol offices. Have a look at even the English language papers, and you see very few stories that are kind of man on the street type things, bottom up. They tend to be articles based on press releases issued from the kinds of organizations that issue press releases. And there's not a great deal of investigative reporting. And so I think that is a bit of a problem. So this sort of idea that this, for example, you take anything over the years, like something that emerged in the last sort of 20 years or so, was that to the astonishment of anyone who came to Korea in the 60s, 70s, 80s, even early 90s, is Koreans have lost interest in North Korea. That sort of thing came out late, years after it was happening, out of surveys. Whereas had there been a real investigative reporting culture in this country, you would have learned that much earlier. The other weakness of their system is that they're very, very dependent on chaebol money. If E.J. Young, as he languishes in jail, wakes up tomorrow morning and thinks, all this money that we've paid out to journalists, to media over the years, hasn't done me any good. Look at me, I'm in jail. What good has it done to me? Because there's so much money, and this is a $1 billion a year largesse from the main chaebol and big government organizations, goes to sustain media. And I'm not talking about normal advertising. This is unnecessary donations. And for that reason, reporting on the chaebol is very, very weak. Any serious, once a scandal hits, like say the Lotte Group problems recently, the press can't avoid writing about it. But other big things, like a few years ago, the chairman of Samsung was pardoned. He was found guilty and given a suspended sentence, but then President Lee Myung-bak pardoned him. That was a one-day news story. There wasn't a single column, a single editorial analyzing this, discussing it, saying is it a good thing or a bad thing. There was no follow-up. In 2 days it had gone. And that's a consequence of chaebol money sustaining newspapers. And so I think chaebol stories are seriously underreported.
Can I just follow up on that? It's very interesting. Of course, the money and influence issue probably is a big factor there, but would you ascribe any other reasons to that? Like, could an independent newspaper, like something I.F. Stone's Reader back in the 70s, 60s and 70s, like not depending on money, or is there some deeper cultural fear of confronting authority in a hardcore journalistic way?
Well, not in confronting authority, because as you can see, this is a very, very feisty democracy. The president's criticized all the time. That, I don't think, is a problem. I think the problem is economics. Not just the survival of media itself, but if there's one thing about Korean journalists, which is, as you can probably tell from my accent, I'm British. British journalists do not feel that their role in life is to defend the British economy. And if the government said to them, you know, you should write positively about British companies because they're British, they'll just get laughed at. I guess they're saying the same in the States and most other countries. But in this country, journalists have seen their mission as sort of guardians of Korean national interest, and that is often an economic thing. So pounding away at the chaebol might be okay for a day or two, but there's a risk then to the broader economy, and they don't like to go there.
as someone who's not a journalist or reporter, I was thinking it's not so much a question of something that I feel is underreported. I'm more someone who writes about culture. And there are a lot more books now coming out about Korean culture than there were even 5 years ago. There's books on K-pop, on food, on all kinds of very good books. The thing I see, though, it's not so much a reporting issue, it's more of a cultural one, where this one idea I keep bumping up against, and we were talking about a little earlier, is this idea that, or this assumption, I should say, that in driving to modernize and the economy and their country in many ways, that there's an assumption by many Western observers that the goal was to become, in some sense, a Western country, in more or less all of the cultural and social and legal particulars. And when they see that not happening, when they see any sort of deviation or difference, it's more seen as like a falling short, or the word nearly comes up a lot. I've heard the Korea term the land of like nearly or like near miss. And in order to say something like that, your assumption has to be that the goal was to become a Western country, where my feeling for a long time has been that that was not the goal, it was never the goal. The goal was to be Korea, and I think, Mike, you nailed it in your book. I was reading this the other day. The goal was just to be better, I think. They were not trying to be another England or another America. They were just trying to be a better Korea, and however they choose to define that. So I find that's an idea that I kind of bump up against a lot in my writing. That's a kind of an idea that I've kind of gone to war with for the past few years, and I find it kind of it's necessary to kind of keep saying that. I find myself repeating myself a lot, but that was just what came to mind when that issue.
Let me just add one thing. I just remembered the bit that I forgot. Jeffrey's example was about the adoptees. But there's one that I write about in here that I hadn't really been. I'd sort of knew it, but kind of never really thought about it. I've never seen it. I've seen the occasional article, but nothing serious. And that is that the situation of Jehovah's Witnesses. Jehovah's Witnesses they're not a popular sort of minor religion here. So nobody really cares about them. But there are, at any time in South Korea, there are about 600 young men, Jehovah's Witnesses, in jail because they refuse to do military service. And it is a total non-issue in this country. Nobody cares. There's been no effort to sort of adjust what military service is, to find it, because they basically refuse to pick up a gun, because that means learning how to kill people. But in other countries that have military service, like European countries, you can work in hospitals, you can do all sorts of things. There would be other ways to allow for this, and this country has, I would argue, more freedom of religion, besides this point, more freedom of religion even than our country, particularly more than European countries, which a lot of them which have state religions. That itself is an infringement on religious freedom. But this country doesn't have that. There is true religious freedom here, with that exception, and I find that there's almost zero reporting on that.
Well, that's strange, because I know some of my former high school students have done myriads of different kinds of positions fulfilling their military obligation that didn't involve guns or formal military training at all.
I think it's that they all have to do boot camp. I think they all have to do the initial.
But like with Koreans, they do several ways to get out of doing it. They cut off their index finger, so you can't pull the trigger, and you're not accepted into the military. So if they allow an exception for the Jehovah's Witnesses, they'll have to allow exceptions for other people. So the only exceptions are the ones under the table, like you mentioned before, what the money is. And all of the others, they can't allow that social exception.
Okay, interesting answers from all of you, thank you. Let's move on to a simple question about what you are all working on now. What's in the works for your next projects? John, why don't you start?
Well, I'll be really brief on this one. Well, I've just launched a new blog. I think you mentioned Korea Fix, which is the follow-up to the Sweet Pickles blog, which is a focus on Korean culture and books. So that's been my primary occupation this summer, just trying to get that up and running. I had a book project kind of on the go before Culture Shock came along, which was not necessarily about Korea. It was more of a oral history about American expats and talking about the reasons they left America, how their sense of national identity evolves. And I'll go back to that at some point. I've been dragging my feet a little bit and busy. I do have a good excuse, but that's been what I've been doing lately.
Okay, my one is, I'm actually done with Korea. Okay. What I've always wanted to do all my life, when I grow up, I'm going to do it, is to write fiction. And I've never had the courage to do it, but I've started a novel now. And I started about a month ago. I was planning it out for about 4 months, and I started it about a month ago. I had this extraordinary experience. I don't want to talk about it too much because I'm very superstitious. When I was a high school student, for our school magazine, I interviewed in our hometown a very elderly gentleman who was a writer, a local writer. And he said, you know, I said, oh, I want to be a writer as well. And he said, here's my one bit of advice. The energy for writing is like a steam inside a kettle. It's inside you. If you talk about it, you're letting the steam out. It'll come out in your talking about it. So keep quiet. So I don't really want to talk about it, but I will say one thing that I found was, I start off this first sentence. It's a historical novel based on in a certain location, and I was describing a trail, a path going around a hillside, and I wanted there to be kind of a curve in there for a sort of poetic reason. And I immediately started Googling, because this is the journalist in me. If there isn't really a curve in there, I can't put it in. So I started Googling to see if I could, and then I stopped and thought, I can make this shit up. You know, your whole journalistic training is against making stuff up. So I'm having to unlearn this and revel in imagination. It's almost like unethical. You can make stuff up. You know, he took a drag cigarette. No, he didn't really. You're just making that up. You're lying. I've got to unlearn all of this.
Welcome to the club, Mike.
So he's been lying for years. So, but I have a new admiration for people like Jeffrey who can do this. It can be very easy to read, but it's quite difficult, and you get these waves of insecurity washing over you, like, you know, oh, you're crap. You know, this is rubbish. And I promised myself, because frankly, most of my journalist friends who write novels do not do it well, because they fail to dramatize, and they fail to create characters. They tend to report, because that's what they're good at. And I've promised myself that I'm going to finish this one, but if it's rubbish, I'm just going to rip it up, like James Joyce throwing it in the fire, hoping my wife will rescue it, and not do it again, but this is what I'm doing now.
Okay. I've actually finished my 11th novel. I actually finished it last year, and I'm out working on my 12th and 13th one simultaneously. Actually, whenever I encounter writer's block, I kind of jump from one book to another. So at any time, I might be working on 2 or 3 different stories. Someone asked me if I'm going to write a sequel to Bureau 39, and that sort of put the idea into my head. And actually, in the novel itself, there are a few loose ends that could be explored. So I might have 2 or 3 stories that will follow this one. So I keep busy. My only problem is that I have 4 children at home. So when I'm chasing and running after them and trying to get them to go to bed at 9 o'clock, that's when Daddy can write. So after I do a full day of teaching and then chasing the kids around the house until 9 o'clock, usually around 10 or 11, that's when I'm able to write. So I do most of my writing when everybody else is sleeping. So I'm just happy to be able to finish something. But it keeps me busy. And actually, my second oldest son, I dragged him down from day job to come here so to experience something like this. But yeah, that's what I'm working on. So. And also working on promoting this book, because one of the things about being a writer is that, you know, we are in the business of promoting our own works and trying to promote, you know, to market. And these days, I'm an indie writer. Okay, I'm a self-published writer. I don't have a publishing house, you know, that's taking care of everything. So basically, I'm doing everything. You know, I'm writing, I'm hiring someone to edit, hiring someone to do the cover design, working on that, and then I'm also in the business of promoting it and trying to actually get it out for people to read. So I find, okay, I mean, I'm really getting off topic here, but I find one of the challenges of a writer is actually trying to promote one's work after you finished writing it. And it's really difficult these days, because you know, most of you know nowadays anybody can write a book. You know, anybody that's got a computer can write a book, upload it to Amazon. In 48 hours, you're a published writer. And the market itself is getting so saturated with so many people writing. And I've watched it since 2010 when I published my first book, how saturated the market is. So I find myself, you know, writing and spending that other extra time. I'm not chasing my kids around, trying to find people, trying to find ways to promote my book. So, but I love what I do. Okay, I want anything else to do in life except this. So.
With apologies to Michael and John, I'd like to follow up on that, Jeffrey. You've been in a unique position here as a fiction writer. Your own novel writing or fiction writing process, if you could just talk a little about that, how you start a project, continue a project, and finish a project. Where do you start with? Do you start with a plot? Do you start with characters? Do you know where you're going? Do you know how it's going to end? I know writers have different methods, and
it always
talk to that.
Yeah, it always begins. It was a dark, stormy night. That's how I begin. No, actually, it was a dark, stormy night. The writing process. That's a really good question, because sometimes it's a newspaper article that I might come across, or a news story. This novel actually was based. It was a story in 2013. Former Army Ranger was arrested in Phuket, Thailand, along with some Russians, trying to smuggle 100 kilograms of methamphetamine that was produced in North Korea. And it was from that news article that this book actually the story itself was about something else, but once I read that news article, that was sort of the direction. The last book I finished, it's called Sinkhole. It was a news story about a home in Florida. I forget how many years ago. Somebody was in his house, and his house was swallowed by a sinkhole, and he was in the bedroom sleeping. So some of my stories would come from newspaper articles or something that I've read. But the writing process, I used to be a film major. Many moons ago, I was a film major. And when I begin a book, I always see a movie. I'm always seeing scenes. I'm seeing the beginning of the movie, I'm seeing the end of the movie, or the beginning of the book, the end of the book. And I kind of storyboard my novels. I kind of have these ideas, and I start very rough storyboards, or I'll collect photographs, and I'll put these sketches up on the wall in front of my computer. And that's how I begin. And it's the combination of the articles I've read, of news stories. It's this cinematic sort of background that I have. So a lot of people, when they read the books I've written, they say, "Wow, this would make a good movie." And I'm like, well, that's because I probably saw it as a movie when I was writing it. So whether or not that has some bearing on my writing. And then the writing process. I teach writing, and one of the things I tell my students is that, writing is easy, revision is harder. Because one thing when you write, you always have to rewrite. And for me, the revision process, this is the discovery process. And the one thing I really enjoy about writing is that it is about discovery. because no matter if I have some idea in my mind or if I see this movie, usually by the time I'm finished with that book, it's not what I originally intended, because it's always a journey for me. And there's always going to be twists and turns, and sometimes there's going to be a lot of dead ends that I'm going to have to read, sort of back up and start all over again. But it's a process, and it's revision, and it's sort of this process of self-discovery. And sometimes I have these like little eureka moments when I'm writing, and suddenly I go, wow, I didn't think about that before. That's really interesting, and I get all excited, and I try to finish it, And one thing which I started to do recently is I grew up with a typewriter. I grew up with a legal pad and a typewriter. And recently, I've gone back to my roots of writing out my entire novels by hand. There's really something about sitting down with a legal pad and starting to write. I love the feel of a pen in my hand and the ink going onto that page. For me, writing is creating. So I've gone back to the legal pads and the ballpoint pens. And it's so liberating to be actually away from the computer, because these days with a computer, I might write for 5 minutes and go, oh, let me check my Facebook updates. So I'm on Facebook, and then I go, oh, let me see, email. I got this CNN update. So I find myself not writing as much, but once I remove myself from the computer, suddenly the flow of the ideas is much easier. And if I make a mistake, I just cross it out. I don't go back and have to, hit backspace and then try to correct it. I just cross it off and keep on writing. So writing in that sense has become very liberating for me. So a little bit of the process.
Thank you. Sorry, I took a little sidelight down Fiction Avenue there.
Thank you for asking.
Something that's sort of unavoidable these days, the past several months, of course, North Korea, very hot issue, perhaps, hopefully not become literally very hot, either there or here, but perhaps unfairly it's kind of pushed out almost everything else, at least in terms of foreign media, but no doubt any of us who've been home this summer, it's all anybody wants to talk about or ask about. And given your expertise on the peninsula, I'd like to ask sort of a three-part question about the current state of affairs, and you can take any or all parts of this. What will happen? What should happen? And how nervous are you these days?
What will Donald Trump do? What should happen?
Well, I can be very brief on that. I don't really. North Korea really concerns me in the writing that I do. The question of is it safe? Is it, what's going on from the perspective of someone who's thinking about living in South Korea. What's the deal? Am I going to die? I'm cautiously optimistic, although I like everyone a bit on edge. I don't think anything's fundamentally changed in North Korea. But again, I'm not speaking as a North Korea expert. The question that really concerns me that I have to deal with is is it safe to live in South Korea? Am I going to have to worry about this every day? And my answer is still no. I don't think you need to feel threatened, but I think you certainly have to be concerned and have to follow the news. But I'm still here, so that kind of means something, I suppose. If I really worried about it, I suppose I would have I don't know, be in a concrete bunker or something hiding. But I'm not. So actually, Steve, you pointed out one of the things that was actually one of the oversights, I think, in my book, and this is actually kind of telling, because I generally don't worry about North Korea. I think about it, I read the news, but I don't worry about it. And one of the things you pointed out to me, which I hadn't really occurred to me, is like, you don't really mention North Korea. And keeping in mind, this is a book for people who are thinking about living in South Korea, and that's one of their big questions, that they ask me all the time, and I don't really address it. So it is an oversight on my part, but it also tells you something about the level of my own personal level of concern about it.
Well, I realise, talking to an audience of people who live in Busan, you're looking at somebody who lives in central Seoul, right by the Blue House. You must think I have nerves of steel. I'm a real hard man. Actually, no, what was the question? What should happen, what will happen, and what will happen?
And how nervous or scared
I'm
are you?
nervous. I'm not that nervous. And that could be because I'm stupid. I have a horrible track record of predicting the wrong things on the Korean Peninsula. And I predicted that Moon Jae-in would win the last election. That's about the only thing I've ever got right. I think first what should happen is, this is my simplistic view of things. The issue right now is North Korean nuclear weapons. To me, this is not really the real issue. It's obviously of great concern to the US because as each state is allowed to get away with this, in the 60s it was China, then India, Pakistan, Israel, as each state is allowed to get away with it, the nightmare scenario 50 years from now is that every single state in the world has nuclear weapons, and believe me, some nut job, if ISIS had got hold of weapons or any of those sort of people, they would have used them by now. So this is a very, very serious thing, I understand that. But the real situation on the Korean Peninsula, in my opinion, is this. And I think both North and South Korea are sort of guilty of this. You have two states, they're both United Nations members, which claim that the other state belongs to them. In the South Korean constitution, North Korean citizens are South Korean citizens. That is a very, very aggressive thing. In the North Korean Workers' Party constitution, they're committed to recovering the South by whatever means possible. This is their commitment. This is what their objective is. This is a very, very unfortunate type of situation. It means that this issue is not going to go away. What I think, the way I look at it is this. Like it or not, human beings have found a formula that so far, the best formula that we have found for living together in large groups is free market democracy, which is law-based, and within which religion is put to the side as a private choice. That's a basic, simple thing, democracy. I think the whole world is going to go democratic eventually. There are countries who fight against this. There's a big view in Asia that democracy is a Western thing. No, it's not, it's universal. But there's a strong opinion in China and Singapore, places like that justify dictatorship. So in my opinion, when I look at a country like China, I see South Korea under Park Chung-hee or Chun Doo-hwan. And I think they're going to have their moment and become democratic. North Korea is like a country like China under Mao Zedong. It's not even started yet. So the next leadership there will probably be a kind of Park Chung-hee type leadership. There'll be a lot of difficulties and trouble with them, but eventually they'll become a democracy. And when that happens, I think when two countries share the same values, and if they still want it by then, they can unify. Right now, my advice to South Koreans would be, for the sake of peace, let go of unification. Take it out of your constitution. Don't let it be a national objective anymore. Because if you still have unification as a national objective, you're going to get upset. If the Chinese move into North Korea and have huge influence there, the people here are going to be extremely upset. They shouldn't be. They are their own country. So what might happen, when Donald Trump got elected, I actually don't understand the audience in the United States that Donald Trump addresses. I'm more of a kind of liberal kind of person. My familiarity with America is more that kind of urban liberal, like New York Times and all of that. Even if they're a bit conservative or a bit liberal, it's that kind of thing. And so Donald Trump, I was appalled by this man. But I must say, the day he got elected, because my main interest is Korea, I thought, maybe this guy might just do something. And my hope is that he's ratcheting up the pressure he's giving back, he's behaving like no previous American president. It's sort of, so I shouldn't say it's a frontier, but it's like you, it's a no, you. America, Democratic leaders don't talk like that, but he is. It's like, sit on this. And this is the sort of thing that will make the North Koreans back off. It might drive everybody into talks, and Trump may be the person who can come up with some kind of deal that settles this problem. But fundamentally, it won't be settled to everybody's satisfaction because of that underlying contradiction. But temporarily, it might get settled. Okay,
well, Mike, I agree with you about what you said about sort of the two Koreas, and I believe that, you know, if in the future there has to be some kind of regime change in the North, and I think that's the one thing that a lot of people hope for, is that I've heard people say, you know, like dropping cell phones across North Korea instead of having them, you know, be able to listen to things in the South. So I'm very optimistic about that's what I hope will happen. As far as being scared, I recall the 1994 nuclear crisis, and I think that was a really scary time on the peninsula because we did not have CNN, we did not have the internet, we did not have 24-hour news cycle, and we had to rely on everything that was perhaps 2 or 3 days old, like from the Korea Times or the Korea Herald or Stars and Stripes. So when the North Korean minister said that they were going to turn Seoul into a sea of fire, I mean, people were scared. I was teaching at Yonsei University at the time at the Foreign Language Institute, and there were, which we also shared a building with the Korean Language Institute. And I recall there were embassies telling their students who were studying Korean to go back home. So for me, that was really a time when it was really dicey on the peninsula. But since then, I know people said, well, we've been down the same road so many times before. It's like the little boy who cried wolf, like, okay, how many more times is this going to happen? But, you know, living in Daejeon, I'm still pretty close to Seoul. So, and I have family here. And I think about that all the time. Like, what will happen? Should I get my family out, you know, and the next plane, you know, will I continue to stay here for how long? So in that regard, I try to kind of, I'm aware of it, but I try not to let it sort of seize every day of my life. And I do watch the news more, and sadly I have a CNN app on my telephone, and every night when I hear the little buzzing or a light flashing on, I go, oh my gosh, what has Donald done now, you know? And I really sometimes, you know, or sometimes, you know, another missile has been launched or something. So, yeah, there's a fear which I think is sometimes generated by the media, and I think the 24-hour news cycle, and I think sometimes there's a lot of misinformation which gets out there. A lot of people sort of think it's really what's happening. So, in that regard, I just try to, you know, remain very optimistic. Hopefully that there will be a, you know, very peaceful resolution to the situation.
I'm going to ask one more question, and I think we'll have a Q&A time, give you guys a chance. This is sort of a two-part question. You can answer both or either as you wish. If you could choose one thing about Korea to change, what would it be? Or if you could export one thing back to your home country that you think is wonderful, what would that thing be?
What would I change? I think it's this custom of putting toilet paper in a basket. What would I change? The thing I'd like to export to my own country is this sort of sense of going somewhere. I know that a lot of young people today are getting frustrated, they're overeducated, can't get jobs, and there's a thing called the Sampol, which are the people who kind of, the Korean equivalent of dropping out. There are young men, my brother-in-law is like this, that to everybody's consternation, he's got no interest in dating, he's got no interest really in working, he's in his early 30s, you know, there's that. But by and large, one reason this is such an issue, the Koreans are young Koreans are so frustrated, is because they're taught to be very focused and ambitious. You know, you meet some 8-year-old who's playing the violin and they already want to go to Juilliard and become the greatest violinist in the world. You know, I think that's, but in my country, I think America, a lot of you are Americans. America, for Europeans, Americans are very sort of optimistic people. But in Europe, in my country, something like, if I told you earlier I wanted to be a writer, I never told anybody. Instinctively, I had to keep to myself. Because I know in my culture, if I sort of said in my family or to my friends, you know, when I grow up I want to be a writer, they go, what, you? You know, I want to be the Prime Minister. Oh, get off. You know, there's this sort of, you know, you're going to be a school teacher, okay? Shut up. And I'd love to export that sort of personal ambition and a sort of a collective kind of desire to go somewhere. I know it sounds a bit nebulous, but I've always found that very inspiring living here. What would I change? What I'd like to see is I'd like to see Korean democracy become more of a law-based democracy. It's endlessly frustrating to me that I think again, this might sound a bit nebulous, but the state of Korean democracy right now is that the authoritarian leadership has moved out and some version of the people has moved in. And so the establishment, you know, the judiciary and the parliament and so on, and the officials, when the people speak, they feel they have to respond. And they even bend the law to do that. I don't know if I'm making myself clear here. We might talk later about Park Geun-hye. But I wish Korean democracy were more strongly law-based and not sort of people passion-based.
To add something to that, speaking of the law-based, one of the things that affects me most directly, driving, I wish driving were a bit more law-based. That's the thing that personally affects me the most. Because I cross the street, we all cross the street every day. That's my one great fear. When people ask me, in fact, are you afraid of North Korea? I say no, I worry more about the taxi drivers and the bus drivers. Half joking, but I would change that. I would enforce traffic laws a bit better. And I have to say it's improved somewhat. There's been a noticeable improvement. The thing I would export along similar lines, one of the things I've always admired about Korea is this desire to improve and this real belief. I think there's a real core belief that's perhaps a legacy partly of the Confucian emphasis on education, as well as I think there's a role for the Buddhist tradition that teaches you that enlightenment is possible through continual self-improvement. But they really buy into, on a very fundamental level, this idea that education really makes you a better person. And there's just intrinsic value to self-improvement. And it doesn't always survive the pressure cooker of school. A lot of kids have that drummed right out of them. They have that pressure, and I get it. But you do see it. It does survive in a lot of people, a lot of adults, a lot of middle-aged people, even kids. Just this buying into this idea that you can make yourself a better person by learning and studying, and that knowing things is actually cool. It doesn't make you a nerd. I really like that idea. Maybe it does make you a nerd, but maybe nerd. It's cool to be a nerd. But I really like that idea, and if I could maybe export one thing, that would be it. I had a rough time in middle school. I was trying to lower my scores a little bit to be more popular. And if I had grown up in Korea, who knows? I might be the prime minister by now or something.
You?
Yeah, I'd like to. I agree with what Mike and John have said, and of course, what I would export. I agree with the same things. One thing that I notice as an educator, especially when it comes to teaching writing, is trying to help my students to understand the idea of critical thinking. Because a lot of times when they're going through sort of middle school and high school, they're just trying to pass tests to graduate. So their critical thinking skills, when I get them as a university student, they have a really hard time with that. So in that regard, I think that's one of the things I think they should still be sort of focused upon, is sort of the educational system. I think that's still, even though Koreans pride themselves, of course, on education, a lot of times it's just trying to finish a task. Even my children, when they're in elementary school, they get rewards for finishing a task. But when you ask them, well, what did you just do? And they well, I'm not really sure. But I finished the task. That's what you wanted me to do. So I think it's understanding sort of this is part of sort of the educational system. And also about the law-based democracy. I mean, especially crossing the street, things like that. It's still quite dangerous, And I just wish people would sort of, when you're trying to obey the laws and all that. I still can't figure out when you're crossing the street, when you have the green light and cars can keep on still turning while you're walking across the street. I still can't figure that out. But those are the things that I would change and things that I would export to my country.
All right, audience, have at it. John, Michael, and Jeffrey.
My question is for Mr. Breen. Years ago, you had some trouble with the Samsung Corporation not liking one of your satire articles. The libel and slander laws in Korea, even if what you say is true, if it's deemed as damaging someone's reputation, you get in real trouble for it. Do you think this is ever going to change in Korea? They're ever going to change those rules?
I mean, I hope they do. My own country has pretty horrible libel laws. In fact, a lot of Europeans go to Britain to sue people for libel. Yeah, you're right. You've highlighted the very odd feature of Korean defamation laws, which is that, let's say I write an article saying, let's say you just come out of prison because you robbed a bank or something. If I write an article about you and say, here's the guy who robbed a bank, you can sue me for damage, and they can calculate how much damage, like you lost your job, therefore I have to. And truth is not a defense, which is very, very odd. Will it be changed? I'm sure everything changes in Korea eventually, and I think these information. I suspect that once the Chaebol issue starts to get resolved, that there'll be a big impact in laws like that. So I expect it will change eventually.
Thank you.
The journalist can claim or has to claim that the information is in the public interest. Is that the possible defense?
To be honest, I forget what the defense is. I'm not sure. Journalists, if you're sort of a chosen ilbo writer and you've written something that Chaebol doesn't like, it's much more difficult for them to sue you. If you're a small fry, you write something, somehow you're much more vulnerable because it's somehow the chosen ilbo that is seen in the public interest. I'm not sure the legal distinctions there, what the defense is, but basically truth is not a defense. That's the point.
Gus?
Just really kind of following up with that, does that lack of, journalistic or lack of coverage of Chaebol has anything to do with like the Gija club, the reporters clubs that are, kind of a leftover from the Park Chung-hee and Chun Yuan era where access to the government was given through these associations of major news, all the major news outlets in Korea, and if you were to report something against the government, you lose access.
Right.
And I'm not sure about, I haven't really been following these clubs, but I'm wondering if that also doesn't apply to the Chaebols and major industry as well, like this association of top tier. And that's kind of why you don't see a lot of disparity in the way or the views taken by different media, whereas we have, the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times are completely opposed, usually politically opposed, but you don't see that as much in Korea. I think that has something to do with it. I wonder if it also figures into the.
I think, yeah, it's connected there, but there's slightly different issues. The Kija clubs that you're referring to is the way a newsroom in a South Korean newspaper is structured is that it's often structured by what we call a beat. So if you're on the defense beat, the beats used to be defined by government ministries, and you can add a few more. There'll be a Samsung beat, an LG beat, and something like that. And so what you're describing is this system where, let me just say, if you're in an American newspaper and you are a defense reporter, you will work either from your newspaper office or from home or Starbucks, wherever it is, and you will go to the Pentagon, you'll go to defense companies, you'll talk to analysts, you'll go differently. In Korea, you're based out of the Defense Ministry press room. So there's an inherent sort of bias there, because you're getting fed press releases from the ministry. You're developing contacts that you don't like to burn. I think that's what you're alluding to. You develop contacts. The odd thing is, the reporters in these clubs from different newspapers feel themselves to be colleagues. Their rivalry is with newspapers with reporters on their own newspaper. So if you're on the business desk of a newspaper, if you're one of 10 reporters on the business desk, and let's say you're assigned to Samsung, you almost see the rivals from other newspapers also covering Samsung are like your friends and colleagues. But your competition is back on your desk, where you're competing for promotion and things like that. So because of that very odd situation, there's sort of an agreement not to break scoops. And there are occasions, I've heard of occasions, I remember once hearing that a friend of mine who was covering the foreign ministry, I had dinner with her one night, and she was a little bit late. I said, "Why are you late?" She said, "We just had a meeting." I said, "What was the meeting about?" There'd been some news, a story had broken connected with the foreign ministry. And she said the meeting was, we all agreed not to report it. So that's how I can come and have dinner with you, or something. So it's slightly different from the Chebol thing.
Can we get down to brass tacks?
Say again?
Can we get down to brass tacks?
Meaning?
Meaning, like, we're all living here on this peninsula, right?
Right.
Right. So what are we worried about? The rest of the world is worried about some kind of nuclear Armageddon. Are they not? I've been in the States recently, and they're all like, "What the fuck? Where you live in Korea? You're from the north? Like, were you stupid, bro? Like, I wouldn't be here if I was from the north."
Yeah, we already discussed that.
Okay.
Were you here, Brock?
Let it go.
I know James.
Sorry.
I was going to say, I know James wanted to ask James a question.
Well, I think my question is kind of directed to Mr. Breen, Mr. Miller, but Mr. Bocskay can chime in. But we talked about this earlier. Broadly, I'm curious about your thoughts about the Park Geun-hye scandal. But more specifically, I'm kind of curious, how is it that Park Geun-hye and Ms. Che are guilty of extortion at the same time that E.J. Young is guilty of bribery? I'm having a problem, I've had a problem trying to understand how, on the one hand, somebody's being extorted, at the same time they're bribing somebody. it seems like a sort of a fundamental, at a level of abstraction, it's a fundamental contradiction. And so I was hoping maybe you might help me understand that better.
I definitely can't answer that.
Oh my God, you got me on my pet subject here.
Well, anything you wanted to say
One
about
of my
that.
problems with this, and I'll be perfectly honest, is my office is down in Kwangamun in Seoul, where all those demos are. And my writing day is a Saturday, when all the demos are happening. Also, I live about 300 yards from the Blue House. So I walk through the demos to go back home at night. And all the demonstrators for the last 9 months were all around the alleyways around my house, peeing up against walls and stuff like that. So my wife, who used to be, I used to think she was a communist, has now become rather pro-Pakistan.
Is that a bad thing? She's a communist?
No, I think that was a good thing. She was sort of very pro, I'm sort of joking, she was very pro sort of Nomukhan and all that sort of thing, yeah. She's swung over onto the other side. Well, no, she's not become right, she's actually become a feminist. Which is why I've sort of escaped here.
Unlucky for you.
Actually, where am I going with this? Your question is, I suppose the way they get around that is sort of collusion. In other words, the three parties conspired to do something illegal. The problem I have with all this is quite simple, is that when you look at something in the States, when Watergate started to Nixon resigning to preempt a impeachment process, took 2 years. There's a process you go through. There's innocence until proven guilty and all that sort of stuff, which Korea has as well. In this case, it took, what, 2.5 months for her to be impeached? I forget what it was now. 2.5 months for the National Assembly to impeach her, and then a couple more months.
Protests.
Yeah. So the thing is that the original protests were over an issue about, suddenly they realized this president had a close friend who...
Choi Shil,
Yeah,
they found her
Choi Shil.
laptop or some tablet.
And the tablet they found wasn't even hers.
Speeches.
It wasn't even hers. It belonged to somebody who worked for Park Geun-hye during her election campaign. That's why the speeches were on there. It wasn't even, and the court didn't accept it as evidence. So there was a big demo about this. Millions of people came out in the street. They started demanding her impeachment. And the National Assembly, seeing the way the wind was blowing, thought, oh, we better impeach. They came out with a bunch of pretexts, impeached her. The Constitutional Court rejected all but one of the pretexts and said she's impeached because she colluded with her friend. Now, there's a court case trying to find out if that's true or not. This is a bit hard about it, isn't it? It's a bit sort of wrong way around, you know. So that's my sort of take on this. I find it, I mean, I thought she was a pretty crack president, to be honest with you. I think it's great to have a woman president. It's great to break these sort of barriers.
But don't forget, she
good.
was the daughter of a dictator, you know, and her...
Yeah, but that doesn't make her a dictator. She was elected.
Agreed, but still, like, she comes from that cloth.
Well, that was her stupid mistake, was to hire some of her father's people as advisors. But I think the way they get to your question is the three parties colluded together. But basically, my view of the judiciary in this case is that they're straining to find the legal justification to do what the people want them to do, which is put them away for a few years. They'll get pardoned pretty quickly, and it'll all be over. I don't think justice has been served, frankly. I think a certain kind of political justice has been served, but legally I think it's very problematic.
I think there's a... let me just speak.
There are other people
I'm
who
leaving
their hand
right now. I'm leaving right now. I'm just going to say
No,
one
it's
thing.
cool. You can please stay.
There's a connection between the Stay Wall and George W. Bush. Okay?
Questions?
And chemtrails too, I think. Yes, you go ahead.
Why am I sitting up front?
All right. Yeah, my question is, it's actually sort of a two-part question, but it's for all, the first part is really for all three of you. The second part might be more for Mr. Breen, who it's my understanding, also does business consulting here in South Korea. So you've all mentioned the law-based system, and you were talking about the Constitution, and how one of the problems here is that both the South and the North believe the peninsula is all theirs constitutionally. So B.R. Myers has written that one of the fundamental misunderstandings here with people about the Koreas is that they're not actually separate ideologies in the way we look at the Cold War. The North is radical nationalism and the South is moderate nationalism. And so they're both feeding off the same type of ideology. I'll leave, that's the sort of the first part. What would you say to that comment from B.R. Myers? And as an extension of that, the second part is, we now have a president who has suggested his constitutional referendum will include an obligation for future governments to respect the 1994, 2000, and 2007 agreements, which speak towards confederation with the North, i.e. that the South Korean government will have to move towards confederation. That will be an obligation for future governments. So in that take, would you at this time be suggesting that foreign companies start to invest in Korea, knowing an election is coming up in the middle of next year, when Moon Jae-in might find more seats in parliament than he currently has?
I was gonna go with that first.
Well, yeah.
What, you want to take the first one? What was the question? Extreme nationalism versus modern nationalism?
I think Brian Myers' great contribution to understanding of Korea is in his book, The Cleanest Race. He answered the question that had puzzled people for a long time, that if North Korea is communist, why hasn't it collapsed yet? He explained that, well, it's not communist. It's more Nazi. It's kind of extreme race-based nationalism. And he's also characterized South Korea as kind of, how do you put it, North Korea light, like sort of a lighter version of that. And I can see where that comes from, and I can see how in conversations with students and with South Koreans, particularly sort of liberal or, you know, liberal in the Korean sense, opposition, well now ruling party type Koreans, I see where it gets understanding. But my perspective is slightly different in that if you ask yourself, try this test, ask a Korean friend of yours, what are the values of this country? And they'll probably say, well, you know, the race, like nationalism, they'll feed what Brian's talking about. Nationalism, filial piety, friendship, loyalty, all these kind of things. But I would argue, this is what they learned at school. These are old values. South Korean values now, if you ask yourself, why do these people demonstrate out on the streets? They're demonstrating about injustice, unfairness, abuse. They have democratic values. This is a democracy, and they're not going to lose it. And if the North Koreans think these people here are weak, it's because their posture is a little bit, oh, come, let's talk, oh, let's not all get upset, oh, America, please, Mr. Trump, don't be, you know. These people here will destroy them if pushed to it. You know, they will fervently back what they deeply hold to be true and what they value, which is democratic values. I slightly disagree with him in that I don't think South Koreans are articulating this or teaching their children this, but their values are now democratic. This is what people get angry about, and this is what they want to defend. And now I've forgotten the rest of your question.
It was about if future governments are obligated to follow confederation, then.
Well, let me let John go. What I would say is, I'll sort of answer that by skirting it slightly, which is that we were talking earlier about should we be afraid on the peninsula. I'll tell you when to be afraid. If as a result of this tension with North Korea, the US enters talks with North Korea, and the result is some kind of Korean War peace treaty where there's, I don't think this will happen. I mean, the peace treaty might happen, but I don't think what I'm going to say will happen. But if somehow the US were no longer committed to defending South Korea, that's the time to get out. Because I think these nuclear weapons are intended to be used. It may sound a bit extreme, but actually I'm getting this from a defector who told me. But and I'm not sure how fully I believe this, but this guy's view, he was the defector who came from the British Embassy, the Korean Embassy in London.
Diplomat.
Yeah, the diplomat. He said, remember how the US used nuclear weapons against Japan? You just one here, one there, and you shell shock the country, you move in and take over. He thinks that the North Koreans now realize there will never be revolution in this country, but they haven't given up their dream of taking over. So the nuclear weapons are intended for use, but they're not going to be used against America, that's foolish. They're not going to be used against Japan, that's foolish. They're intended for use against South Korea. They're not intended to help a regime survive. They're intended to push a unification. So no, that's the time when to get nervous. I think the Confederation thing is all well and good. It's fine. It's all sort of part of South Korean commitment to peaceful cooperation and all that. See, I don't think it's going to commit them to do anything really stupid.
Can I just interrupt at the bar? Can I get a pale ale, please? The power of the microphone.
I just wanted to add one point. I didn't have anything to add to the Confederation. The question of nationalism, hardcore versus what did you call it, moderate? There's was that
B.R. Myers called it
okay.
moderate nationalism.
Citing B.R. Myers. I've read his book, as you know, and I agree that North Korea is undoubtedly this race-based nationalism. I worked there. There's a phrase I picked up. I think my only contribution to this conversation recently, I've heard South Korean nationalism described as a laid-back nationalism. It was a phrase that I kind of like. And if you think about it, I'm kind of more inclined to think, but I see some people kind of smirking. It came up in reference, I should probably explain, to there's this new television program, I forgot the name of it, where they take 3 foreigners like from a country and they sort of expose them to culture. I know, radical new idea, right? But this one's a little bit different in that they're not, in the past those shows were all about sort of taking people and sort of promoting a certain aspect. Here's what we want you to know about Korea, here's what we'd like you to take away from Korea. Whereas this show's angle is more like they're just sort of kind of throwing them out there and getting what's, to my impression, a more sort of honest feedback. And there seems to be more of a genuine interest, like an underlying knowledge that, okay, we know this is kind of cool somehow, people like this, but we want to know just sort of what people think. So it was a step toward what they were referring to as a sort of a laid-back nationalism, a confidence and a pride in the culture that was obvious, but it was a little bit less, in your face, like, here's, Korea, take this home, this is what we want you to know about the country. So maybe that's, I don't know. It was the only thing I really wanted to add to that.
Hey. I have, first of all, there's a long-time resident of Korea and studying Korean history and so forth. Korea has always been a country of duality, and it affects every part of Korea on every scale. So, North Korea and South Korea is the obvious one, but within South Korea itself, you're going to have 2 distinct groups that are always trying to get each other back. So, throughout all of the presidents, from even Park Chung-hee, after Park Chung-hee's shot, right? But then you have Chun Doo-hwan and No Pyong-woo, right? So you have, and they No Tae-woo, they were jailed by the next president, and then the other president, his son was attacked because of that, and then it goes on. Every time you change a president, they go back and they attack the old president and get back, and then they steal and do the same thing that the other guys are doing, and that's the repetition here. How much of that do you think is the reason for like Lotte, their attack suddenly on Lotte? Because Lotte is a Korean family that's based in Japan. So they made them say, is this a Japanese company or is this a Korean company? And they're trying, they took away a lot of their rights for tax-free stores and so forth. How much do you think of this is getting back at Japan for not doing things that Korea wants them to do?
I think that's over my pay grade.
Are you talking about the latte issue when it broke a couple of years ago or right now?
Yeah, well, it's a continuation, you know? It's they never attacked the latte before.
Well, no, I think my understanding, I mean, I may be wrong here, I haven't looked at it from that point of view of being an attack on Japan per se. I think latte was its own worst enemy. I mean, its internal battle between the 90-year-old father and his two sons fighting, the Japan-based son and the Korea-based son, fighting became a media issue, and because it got into the media, see, the people, public sentiment, required government action. So I think and then the Lotte Group went into overdrive to protect themselves. One strategy was offering a golf course for THAAD missile battery. Another was draping a giant Korean flag down the side of their new building. You know, that was a good one. But I think on that thing that you described, it's been typical, and it's continued through democratic administrations, where the incoming administration conducts anti-corruption drive targeting the previous administration, which traditionally it was sort of a way of looking pure. You know, we're coming in, pure-minded people,
Cleaning house.
Cleaning house and that kind of thing. And I think the underlying problem there is the power of the Korean presidency is too great. You know, there's too much power in the Blue House, and so it naturally leads to abuses. You know, I think in an American, tell me if I'm wrong here, in an American context, if Barack Obama had a close friend like Chae Soon-sil, who benefited from her connection to him, would it be such a big
Oprah.
But it sort of offended people here because there is so much scope for abuse here. If you're the best friend of the president and you have access all the time, you're going to be so tempted. There's going to be people offering you millions. And I think that's part of the problem. So I don't see anything changing. I think what we've got now, we might have discovered a new strategy here, which is protest by impeachment. I wouldn't be surprised if before his term is up, there's a big drive to impeach Moon Jae-in about something.
That's the payback thing.
Yeah.
It's just continual. One more, just a short question. How come North Korea is in the news all the time now, but none of the correspondents ever can say Pyongyang, right? It's always Pyongyang.
Yeah.
Why is that? Do you think they're deliberately not pronouncing the country right? I mean, there's got to be people that know it's Pyongyang, not Pyongyang.
Right, Michael,
You know?
Michael, what's the capital of France?
What's the capital of France? I don't know, I've been there.
Capital of Germany?
Capital of Germany, Berlin, right?
You just said it like an American. I don't know how you say
You know
it.
why? I am American. No, but I'm just saying, but I mean, the difference is that this is, you know, in other countries and people just, you know, if you have some person's name, you try to make sure you get it right. Even if it's a difficult name, a Russian name, or an Indian name, or whatever it is, you try to get that pronunciation, spelling right, especially even CNN, they do a lot of that for the dignitaries, but whenever they talk about North Korea, Kim Jong-un in Pyongyang, you know, like that, it's
Mr. O.
Or Donald Trump in Puerto Rico, that was a disaster.
Yeah, so
Maybe they're trying to avoid that.
I don't know. Anyway, that was kind of a short question. Thank you.
CNN, they call it the Hyundai Corporation.
Right, yeah.
Well, that's partly Hyundai's fault.
Yeah.
Because when they introduced Hyundai cars into the United States, they wanted to make it sound more like a Japanese car company. So instead of calling it Hyundai, they called it Hyundai.
We're going to have one more question, and then we will, if you have anything else you want to ask, just, you know, in the, come up and have a chat, buy a book, drink a beer, and,
Not too good.
but,
Right, by the way, just just so we can close the event, I didn't want to shut anyone off, but we're going to be around for a while too. So if you have any other questions, don't feel shy about a question.
Just to clarify, I think the Lotte's golf course was expropriated. It wasn't offered.
Oh, was it? Okay.
The government said, we want it.
Okay.
I'm curious on your take on education. We can all kind of find things to complain about, but what positive changes have you seen? And what's the forecast? Do you think the Sunung is going to be around forever? Do you think Korea will adapt for the 21st century economy somehow?
Boy, 27 years in Korea teaching. The entrance examination, the students still studying early education, what is it, the last figures I heard, $1,000 for a month for each child. All the hog ones. Every day I take my children to elementary school, but also I see a lot of 2- and 3-year-old kids going to these preschools, these kindergartens. And every morning I see all the mothers taking the kids outside, and all the buses coming. And this is every day. And I think, in America, we never had that. I mean, we waited till kindergarten, or I went to first grade, it was elementary school. And I've seen the education system getting better, but I think there's a lot of the old ways. And one thing I noticed that, parents will say when I teach them English, and now I'm teaching, their children English, who, I taught, their parents, 20 years ago. They said, well, when I'm a parent, I'm not going to make my kids do that. But of course, when they become a parent, they're still going to make their kids take those classes. So I think it still has a long way to go, but I think in some ways it is getting better in terms of sort of the certain sections on the test. I see in terms of English, I know one thing is that whenever I saw the grammar sections on the test, I couldn't answer those questions. Thinking well, this is something that I would never teach students. Something that I was never taught unless I was studying grammar or linguistics. So I think if they move away from that, to more sort of again, I mentioned before, creative thinking, sort of getting critical thinking, things like that. So maybe that will happen. But one thing I noticed too is that I teach at an international business school, so I'm getting students, from Korea, from China, from Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, Russia. One thing about the Korean students who come to my school, many of them, they have studied abroad. That they went to the Philippines, they went to New Zealand, they went to Australia. So now we're seeing this generation of children who actually did not go through the Korean education system because their parents sent them to another country. So they're coming in, and their English and their ability is a lot different than it was the students I taught, say 20 or 25 years ago. So if that answers your question, or I think it's still, there's a lot that needs to be done. And I hope that, that it will change, but just what I've seen, as an educator, I still believe that there's a lot of things that needs to be done.
Can I ask a follow-up on that?
Yeah.
Point? You talked about the Sunung, you talked about English education. It's big business here.
It is.
Now, Korea is one of the only countries in the world where they do things ass backwards, to speak. When I was in high school, my teacher was a native speaker of French, or a native speaker of German. And if I were to if they were to ask me to make a Korean education program for the New York public schools, and I got a group of professionals who have lived in Korea for 20 years, and they're all foreigners, and we include no Koreans, how good do you think those books would be? Not so good. That's exactly what's happening in Korea. When they make the Sunung and when they make the textbooks, no foreigners are included in the top decision-making process of the English education system. And when they send foreigners to the schools to teach, they're at the bottom level. The Korean teachers have power over them. Tell them, no, you just teach pronunciation.
Is this a question?
Yes. I just want to say. Was that a question? I was just going to ask, do you think that this is going to change in the future, where they'll finally have, say, the only way to get rid of that, what you're saying, is to have people who really speak the language well write the damn tests and write the books for the students. So, I mean, and I see that as a power play here in Korea, not that they really want to speak English well, but that it's a power play because English is such a big business. Do you think that the foreigners will ever get their say?
Well, I don't know. I mean, I agree with you in that it is, where the educators, I mean, they're asked, sort of just to sort of come in and just sort of, be the monkey in front of the class and that kind
Fill
of
in
thing.
the blanks.
Yeah, well, another thing too is even, I've seen it in other areas too, like, a classic example was during the 2002 World Cup, where they tried to make World Cup one word, and I remember it was Owen Sweeney at Korea Times said, no, World Cup is two words. And it was just the fact that, it's just, we're going to hire people to do this sort of thing, and then, if somebody says, well, it's wrong, well, that's too bad. And I've seen this happen a lot of times. It's just that, if you want to do something a certain way, you hire experts or people that are professional in that field to do it. And that way you can avoid, sort of like you said, sort of this sort of, roundabout way of doing things.
So, oh no, I was going to ask.
I think there's another way that I look at this. I mean, I'm not an education expert by any means, but one thing I do notice, because I do business here, is I find there's great difficulty in this country. People have great difficulty assessing value. And I mean, let's say you've got 10 young people applying for a job at your your company. The human resources people have great difficulty in assessing value. So what they do is they go by credentials. So if somebody's from Seoul National University and somebody else is from Busan National University, or let's say a more obscure university, the Seoul Day applicant will just get chosen simply because that's where they went. Now that happens in other countries, Oxford, Cambridge, Harvard, that happens elsewhere. But I think this is beginning to change and now it'll certainly change if the chaebol can get break, if the chaebol structure of the economy changes. But when you're hiring people, see what the chaebol have done traditionally is that they will take thousands of young people every year. As long as when the economy was going up 5, 6, 7, 8% a year, they would take in thousands every year, knowing they were useless. Even if they were they would take them from the top universities, knowing they were useless. Then they would then put them through their chaebol boot camp. And literally in the old days, like in the 80s, this would literally, say with Samsung, involve, they would drop somebody in the middle of the countryside in Gangwon-do with a rice cooker and say, you have to make your way back to headquarters on your own steam. So the person would have to sell the rice cooker and, in other words, it's kind of like a semi-military thing. And then they would decide, okay, I know you studied engineering, but we're going to put you in human resources. I know you studied this, but we're going to put you in this one. And then they would start training them. That system is now changing, and they need people who have critical thinking and stuff like that. So they're coming up with ways to test this. The interview process is more profound than it used to be. And I think this is partly behind the government's got this new thing where they're not allowed to, they're not allowed to request a photograph on CVs anymore. Or even which university you went to, they're not allowed to ask now. So they have to decide which among the candidates is the best candidate without knowing which university they went to, without seeing if they're pretty or not.
But they find out beforehand anyway.
Yeah, the secret sign. So I think that's part of it, that when the demand changes, then the education system will respond.
Thank you.
I'd like, let's give a round of applause to Jeffery Miller, John Bocskay, and Michael Breen. Jeffery Miller, Bureau 39, a really fun political thriller, as they say, ripped from today's headlines. It's got secret agents, methamphetamine, there's some girls in there, right? Some girls.
And just a round of applause for our moderator, Steve Feldman.
Michael Breen, The New Koreans. It is, I'm reading it, it's full of the really clear-sighted thinking and insight and intelligence that we saw on display this evening. And of course, John Bocskay with Culture Shock, Korea. Buy it because he's a cool guy. So, have a beer, feel free to chat with any of our authors, and let's enjoy the evening. Thanks for coming out.
Thank you.